You spent years trying to communicate better, to be clearer, to choose the right words so that people would finally understand what you meant. You believed the problem was in how you expressed yourself, that all it took was finding the right tone, the proper approach, the perfect metaphor. But Carl Jung identified something that changes absolutely everything. The problem was never your communication. It was what you see, and what you see is frightening. Not people outright, not consciously, but on a level they rarely admit to themselves. There is something about you that deeply unsettles them, not because you are aggressive or intrusive, but because you perceive what they hide. And no one, in any culture, in any era, feels completely at ease next to someone who sees through their mask. Jung spent decades mapping the human psyche, and among all his discoveries, there is one that received far less attention than it deserved. The existence of a specific type of individual whose perceptual apparatus operates on a qualitatively different frequency from the average. Not superior in a hierarchical sense, different in a structural sense, as if most people process the world in one resolution and this specific group processes in another, capturing layers of emotional, psychological and relational information that simply do not appear on the common radar. This individual enters a room, and before exchanging a single word with anyone, has already absorbed a considerable amount of data. The tension between two colleagues who pretend everything is fine. The fear disguised as confidence in the tone of the leader who just gave a motivational speech. The poorly concealed sadness behind the polite smile of someone who says they're doing great. It is not mystical intuition. It is not mind reading. It is processing. A sophisticated, constant, and often exhausting processing of micro-signals that the nervous system picks up before the conscious mind even has time to catalogue them. Jung did not call this a disorder. He did not classify it as pathology, as excessive anxiety, or as dysfunctional hypersensitivity. He recognized it as a form of expanded awareness. And it was precisely this distinction that changed everything for those who finally encountered this concept. Because for years, perhaps decades, these people received another message. The message that they felt too much, thought too much, read too much into situations, that they needed to relax, let go, stop complicating what is simple. And here is the cruelty of the misdiagnosis. They believed it. They tried. They spent years trying to calibrate themselves to a frequency that is not theirs, shutting down a system that has no switch, and wondering why they still kept perceiving what they perceived. The answer is that there is no switch. This perception is not a learned behavior that can be unlearned. It is a structure, and structures do not shut off. They either integrate or destroy from the inside out. What Jung understood, and what this video will unfold with clinical precision, is that this differentiated perception is neither an automatic blessing nor a permanent curse. It is an instrument of extremely high precision that, without the proper psychological development, becomes a weapon aimed inward. Because perceiving what no one else perceives is not the same as knowing what to do with what you perceive. And this difference, this gap between perception and integration, is where most people who possess this gift get lost, completely. There is a pattern that repeats with almost mathematical consistency in the lives of highly perceptive people. They do not need to do anything deliberately to destabilize an environment. They simply exist within it. And their presence, charged with a perception that pierces the superficial layers of social interactions, begins to function as an involuntary mirror for everyone around them. Think about what happens when you place a high-definition mirror in a setting where people are used to seeing themselves in foggy glass. No one asked to be seen so clearly. No one gave permission. And the natural, human, and understandable reaction of nearly everyone facing a reflection that exposes what they prefer not to see is to step away from the mirror, or to break it. Not because they are bad people, but because the human unconscious has an extremely efficient defense mechanism called projection. And projection works like this. When something inside you causes discomfort, and you lack the capacity or willingness to confront it internally, you externalize it. You find someone on the outside to carry what you cannot bear to acknowledge in yourself. And the perceptive person, precisely because they see what others carry, becomes the perfect receptacle for this process. Then something happens that, the first time you understand it mechanically, breaks something inside you. The perceptive person is rejected not despite their ability, they are rejected because of it. The discomfort you cause is not a failure of your social skills. It is a direct consequence of you existing at a depth most people are unwilling to inhabit. You noticed the lie and said nothing, but the person felt you knew. You perceived the insecurity behind the arrogance, and even without verbalizing it, something in your posture, your gaze, the way you processed that moment, communicated to the other that the mask had not worked. And the other's response was not gratitude for the implicit honesty. It was discomfort. And discomfort, when unprocessed, becomes distance. Distance becomes exclusion. Exclusion becomes a narrative. There is something wrong with that person. It is a perfect inversion. The only individual in the environment capable of perceiving what is actually happening becomes the problem, not the dysfunctional patterns they detected, not the unconscious dynamics they inadvertently revealed, them. The source of perception becomes the target of rejection. Jung observed this in clinical contexts repeatedly. Patients who came to him carrying years of conviction that they were disruptive, unstable, hard to love, inconvenient. And when he began to dismantle the narrative, what emerged was invariably the same. These people had spent their lives being the unsolicited conscience of groups that had no intention whatsoever of becoming conscious. They perceived the dysfunctional family dynamic, and the family called them dramatic. They felt the hostile energy disguised as friendship, and the friends called them paranoid. They identified the pattern of manipulation in the company's leadership, and the colleagues called them difficult. Every time their internal detector was right, the surrounding environment produced a collective denial, and the perceptive person, exhausted and confused, began to doubt the only reliable instrument they possessed, their own perception. This is what Jung called one of the most devastating possible processes for the psyche. Making a person abandon trust in their own internal reality due to social pressure. Not because their internal reality is wrong, but because the external reality they inhabit lacks the structure to hold so much lucidity. And it is exactly here, at this fracture point where years of discarded lucidity turn into pathological doubt, that the real work must begin. That is why I prepared O Código do Despertar for you, not to tell you that you are special and everyone around you is wrong, but to give you the internal map that Jung spent a lifetime developing, distilled into 60 days of real daily work. 60 lessons, 1 per day, each with a conceptual key based on Jungian psychology, a question that cuts straight to the core of what you carry, and a concrete micro-action that transforms perception into movement. Because perceiving without integrating is suffering. And O Código do Despertar exists to transform what you see into who you become. Access is in the first pinned comment. If this resonates with what you are living right now, write one word in the comments. Awakening. Not for me. For yourself. As a marker of a turning point. But before we move on to what Jung proposes as a path, it is necessary to understand that this heightened perception does not have a single way of manifesting. And the error of treating all highly perceptive people as if they were identical is one of the reasons why both popular advice and superficial psychology completely fail to help them. Jung identified that amplified perception can anchor itself in different psychological functions, and each anchoring produces a distinct profile with specific strengths and vulnerabilities that determine exactly how this gift will consume those who possess it, when there is no work of integration. The first profile is that of the emotional absorber. This individual does not merely notice others' emotions, he feels them, literally. He enters an environment charged with tension, and the tension begins to reside inside him as if it were his own. He sits next to someone depressed and, hours later, is depressed without understanding why. He ends a conversation with someone anxious and notices his own heart rate has changed. It is not empathy in the colloquial and pleasant sense that people like to claim in conversations about sensitivity. It is involuntary absorption. It is the nervous system capturing and internally replicating the external emotional state with frightening fidelity. The problem with this manifestation is not the capacity itself. It is the absence of a membrane, the absence of a functional psychic boundary that tells the nervous system, this is from outside, process it as information, not as personal experience. Without this membrane, the emotional absorber has no emotional life of their own. They have the emotional life of every environment they inhabit, and that, over time, is devastating, because you lose the thread that connects to what you yourself feel, to what you yourself want, to what you yourself are. The exhaustion they feel at the end of a social day is not physical fatigue. It is the exhaustion of having been, without realizing it, the emotional processing system of everyone around them. The second profile is that of the pattern reader. This individual is not especially attuned to others' emotions, but is extraordinarily capable of identifying behavioral structures, systemic dynamics, and inconsistencies between what is said and what is done. He detects the pattern before having enough evidence to verbalize it in a way that others accept. He sees the betrayal before it happens. He identifies the team's dysfunctional dynamic 3 meetings before it explodes. He perceives that the project will fail before any objective data confirms it. The paradox of this profile is that its greatest strength is also its greatest source of social frustration, because he is often right. And being often right before others can verify what you saw does not build credibility. It builds resentment. People do not like those who precede them in understanding situations, especially when that understanding is inconvenient. It is not that he is too intelligent for the group. It is that the group unconsciously perceives that his presence makes it impossible to maintain certain collective illusions intact. And collective illusions are the mortar of many relationships. The third profile is that of the physical sensitive. For this individual, perception is not primarily emotional or cognitive. It is bodily. He feels in his body what is wrong in a situation, a tightness in the chest when someone is lying, a subtle nausea when he enters an emotionally toxic environment, a specific muscle tension when something is going wrong, long before he has any rational data to justify that conclusion. The body is his most finely tuned instrument of perception, and he often knows this intuitively, but has spent his life being taught to ignore it by an entire system of cultural references that teaches that what cannot be measured does not exist. The result is that he distrusts himself, and distrust of the most precise instrument he possesses is precisely what makes him vulnerable. The fourth profile is that of the pure intuitive. This is perhaps the most difficult to articulate and to be taken seriously socially. Perception appears not as emotion, not as pattern, not as physical sensation, but as sudden and inexplicable knowledge. He simply knows, without knowing how he knows, and when asked where that conclusion came from, he cannot trace the logical path, because there is no visible logical path. The processing happened at such a deep unconscious level that consciousness receives only the result, not the process. In a world that demands rational justifications for every conclusion, he learns early that his most powerful instrument is also the least socially acceptable. These 4 profiles are different manifestations of the same central phenomenon that Jung documented. And what is critical to understand is that each of them, without the work of integration, destroys in a specific way. The emotional absorber loses himself in others' experience. The pattern reader isolates himself in the bitterness of being the only one who sees. The physical sensitive falls ill, literally, carrying in his body what the environment produces. And the pure intuitive is dismissed as irrational until the repetition of his hits creates a pressure he himself does not know how to manage. In every case, the breaking point is the same. The most precise instrument they possess is what hurts them the most, because they never learn to operate it consciously. There is an inflection point in the trajectory of every highly perceptive person. A moment when the amount of accumulated psychological information without any adequate processing system begins to exact a price they did not anticipate. And that price is not paid all at once. It is paid in daily silent installments, until one day they realize they are emotionally bankrupt without ever having understood exactly when the money ran out. The first symptom is the dissolution of the self's boundaries. When you continuously absorb the emotional state of the environments you inhabit, when you are constantly processing what others feel, think, and conceal, something begins to happen that Jung considered among the most dangerous processes for the psyche. You stop knowing where you end and where the other begins. It is not a dramatic loss of identity. It does not happen overnight. It is a slow process of erosion. You start adopting others' opinions without realizing they are not your own. You start feeling guilty for situations you did not cause. You start holding yourself responsible for the emotional state of those around you, as if your existential function were to maintain the effective balance of everyone who draws near. And every time you fail at this, because it is impossible not to fail, you feel you have failed as a human being. This is where one of the most subtle and most lethal dynamics Jung described comes in. The highly perceptive person, precisely because they understand the emotional needs of others with extraordinary acuity, becomes the natural target of individuals who need a container for their unprocessed emotions. Not consciously, not through malicious planning, but the human unconscious has a remarkable ability to find partners who complement its internal dynamics, and the unconscious of a person who never learned to process their own emotions tends to gravitate towards someone who absorbs emotions naturally. The result is an asymmetry that deepens over time. The perceptive person increasingly carries the emotional weight of the relationship, and the other, relieved to have such an efficient container for what they cannot process, unconsciously increases the demand. Not because they are cruel, but because the system is in balance for them. The problem is that for the one carrying the load, the balance is unsustainable. It is not that you are weak. It is that you were never taught that being someone else's permanent emotional repository is not love. It is dysfunctional symbiosis. The second symptom is isolation, not chosen isolation, which can be salutary and necessary for someone who processes a great deal. Isolation forced by the exhaustion of being constantly misunderstood. The perceptive person begins to withdraw, not because they prefer solitude, but because social interaction has become a process with too high a cost for the return it offers. Each conversation demands that they manage not only their own internal state, but the emotional state of everyone present, the group dynamics, the veiled intentions, the unspoken tensions. It is like playing chess while everyone around you is playing checkers and insisting the board is the same. The third symptom is the most insidious of all, perceptual paralysis. When you perceive too much, when every decision comes accompanied by an avalanche of information about what could go wrong, about what the other person really wants, about the consequences no one else is seeing, making a simple decision can become paralyzing, because you do not operate with the same cognitive simplification that allows most people to move forward without considering all the variables. You consider them, all of them, simultaneously, and the weight of that can freeze even the most capable individuals. Without proper psychological boundaries, without the work of integration that Jung described as indispensable, extraordinary perception does not elevate. It drains. It is not that the gift disappears. It is that it begins to consume the person from the inside out, like a high-performance engine installed in a structure that was not built to withstand that power. And it was precisely for this breaking point, for this moment when perception becomes a burden instead of an advantage, that O Código do Despertar was built. The first stage of the program is exactly this, learning to distinguish what is yours and what belongs to another, not as a theoretical concept, as a daily, measured and recorded practice. The access is in the first pinned comment. You don't have to carry this alone indefinitely. Jung called individuation the process by which the individual becomes, in fact, what they are, not what the environment demanded they be. Not what trauma shaped out of necessity for survival, not what social pressure approved, what they are in their most fundamental nature. And for the highly perceptive person, individuation is not a generic process. It is urgent. It is the difference between using a gift and being destroyed by it. The first step of the path that Jung traced is differentiation. And differentiation here has a very specific meaning that goes beyond common sense. It is not simply learning to say no. It is not developing the ability to ignore what others feel. It is cultivating the skill of perceiving completely and at the same time remaining distinct, of registering emotional information without becoming the emotion, of understanding what the other carries without carrying it for them. Imagine a competent emergency room doctor. They are in daily contact with pain, trauma and despair at an intensity that would be paralyzing for most people, but they are not paralyzed, because over time they have developed the ability to be fully present for the suffering of the other without merging with it. They feel, they have genuine empathy, but they do not dissolve. There is a line, trained and conscious, between what belongs to the patient and what belongs to them, and it is this line that enables them to help. Without this line, they would be just another victim of trauma, not an agent of healing. The highly perceptive person needs to develop exactly this kind of line, not to feel less, but to use what they feel with precision instead of being governed by it. The second step is what Jung called shadow integration, and here is a critical point that perceptive people often neglect in a specific way. They tend to be extraordinarily competent at seeing what others carry unconsciously, what they are in denial about, what they hide from themselves, what they project. But this same perceptive competence can function as an escape mechanism when it comes to looking inward, because it is much easier, cognitively, to analyze the unconscious patterns of those around you than to confront your own. And the perceptive person who does not do this work ends up living in a peculiar trap. They see everything in others with crystalline clarity and operate from their own blind spots with an unconsciousness that they would be the first to criticize in someone else. The shadow of the perceptive person often includes judgment disguised as analysis, the need for emotional control of the environment disguised as care, epistemic arrogance, the silent conviction that because you see more, know more, and decide better, disguised as genuine concern. These patterns do not appear to her as problems, they appear as evidence of her lucidity, and that is precisely why they are so difficult to confront. Things buried in order to be loved do not die. They leak out as resentment. And the resentment of a person who perceives everything but can say nothing creates an internal pressure that eventually ruptures in ways she herself does not understand. Jung was categorical. There is no real psychological growth without an honest confrontation with one's own shadow. For everyone. But for people of high perception, this confrontation is especially urgent, because their impact on the surrounding environment is amplified by the intensity of what they transmit. Their blind spots do not cause ordinary damage, they cause extraordinary damage, proportional to the strength of the instrument they operate without fully understanding. The third step is the creation of conscious boundaries. And here Jung is not talking about boundaries in the sense that popular psychology has popularized, like a list of things you do not accept, communicated in a difficult conversation. He is talking about an internal psychic structure that defines clearly and functionally where you end. What is yours to process? What belongs to the other and is theirs? What you can perceive without needing to resolve. This structure does not arise naturally in highly perceptive people, because the very nature of amplified perception includes a porosity that without deliberate work has no automatic limits. You must build them, actively, with specific tools, with repeated practice, with the kind of self-observation that is only possible when you have access to a sufficiently precise internal map. And the process is not linear. It is not that you decide to have boundaries and suddenly you have boundaries. It is that you observe when you were crossed, understand how it happened, learn to recognize the signs before the crossing, and gradually build a more conscious response. This takes time, takes practice, takes a development structure that cannot be improvised. History records with brutal clarity what happens when extraordinary perception does not find the path of integration, and it records with equal clarity what happens when it does. And the difference between the two cases is not talent, it is not intensity of perception. It is what each person decided to do with what they saw. Friedrich Nietzsche is perhaps the most devastating example of the first case, one of the most penetrating intellects humanity has produced. An ability to perceive the hidden structures of morality, culture, and collective psychology that was, for centuries, simply incomprehensible to his contemporaries, but a perception that was never contained by functional psychological boundaries, a shadow that was never integrated, an epistemic arrogance that grew inversely proportional to his genuine human relationships. The result was progressive isolation, rupture with almost everyone he loved, and the mental collapse that consumed him in the last 11 years of his life in silence, cared for by those who never understood what he had seen. Nietzsche saw, with a clarity that haunts, but he did not know what to do with what he saw, and perception without integration does not only fail to liberate, it imprisons in the most complete solitude possible, that of being absolutely lucid in a world that has no capacity to understand you. Virginia Woolf presents an equally tragic variation of the same pattern, a perceptual sensitivity of extraordinary richness, capable of capturing nuances of inner human experience that previous literature simply had no language to express. But that same perceptual openness, without the proper internal resources to contain and process it, made her vulnerable to emotional states of overwhelming intensity. She absorbed the world with a depth that had nowhere to go but collapse. Not because she was fragile, but because she possessed an instrument of extraordinary precision and no structure to operate it without being consumed by it. But there is another side to this story. Viktor Frankl spent 3 years in the Nazi extermination camps. As a psychiatrist, his perception of human psychological dynamics in that environment was extraordinarily acute. He saw what happened to the human psyche, subjected to systematic dehumanization. He observed the patterns of breakdown and resistance. He perceived what made the difference between those who survived psychologically and those who dissolved. And he did something Nietzsche could not do. He used that perception as raw material for construction, not just for analysis. Frankl left the camps not destroyed by the perception of the horror he had witnessed and felt. He left with logotherapy, with an understanding of the search for meaning that transformed what he saw into something that served humanity for decades. His perception was integrated through a purpose that transcended personal suffering. The difference between Nietzsche and Frankl was not the intensity of perception, it was what each did with it. Jung identified the pattern with surgical precision. Perception without humility becomes judgment. Perception without limits becomes absorption. Perception without purpose becomes bitterness. And perception without integration of one's own shadow becomes the most efficient weapon of self-destruction that exists. But perception with humility becomes wisdom. With limits, it becomes clarity. With purpose, it becomes service. With the shadow integrated, it becomes the most powerful instrument of human development that exists. There is something that the cases of successful integration have in common that is worth naming with precision. It is not that these people stopped perceiving uncomfortable things. It is that they stopped believing that their function was to force others to see what they saw. Frankl did not spend the rest of his life trying to convince the extermination camps that they were evil. He took what he had seen and built something from it. Jung did not spend his life denouncing the collective unconscious. He developed tools to aid the process of consciousness in individuals who came to him willing to work. Extraordinary perception, when mature, does not announce itself. It does not impose itself. It does not demand that the world align with what it detects. It operates silently, with precision, in service of something greater than the ego of its possessor. One of the most practical and at the same time most neglected aspects of the work that Jung outlined for people of high perception concerns the architecture of their relationships. Not communication techniques, not strategies for how to reveal what you perceive. The selection of with whom you engage in depth. Because here is a truth that is hard to hear but becomes obvious once you accept it. Not every person is at a stage of emotional development capable of withstanding the depth you bring to a relationship. And it's not a matter of intelligence, worth, or kindness. It is a matter of development, of stage, of where each one is in the process of becoming conscious. A person who is still completely identified with their social mask, who has never seriously questioned their projections, who has no practice of self-observation, will invariably react defensively to you. Not because they are bad, but because what you represent to them, your mere presence, is a threat to a defense system they have built over years. And defense systems do not negotiate. They attack or withdraw. Jung was clear about this. Certain genuine connections are only possible between people who have reached a compatible level of self-awareness. Not identical. Compatible. You don't need someone who sees exactly what you see in the same way. You need someone who has the emotional maturity to receive what you perceive without collapsing, without projecting, and without needing to destroy the messenger to feel safe. These people exist. They are rare, not because they are special in some mystical sense, but because genuine emotional development requires work that most people are not willing or equipped to do. But they exist, and finding them changes everything. Because for the first time, you can exist in relation to someone without needing to reduce who you are for the relationship to survive. The process of revealing your perception within a relationship, when it is new, should be gradual. Jung understood that genuine psychological trust is not declared. It is built. You don't start a relationship by exposing everything you perceive. You offer small insights and observe how the other responds. If the response is immediate defensiveness, denial, or the redirection of focus to your supposed problems, you received crucial information. If the response is genuine curiosity, openness, or even the honest discomfort of someone willing to consider what you said, you also received information of a very different nature. This gradualness is not manipulation. It is wisdom. It is the recognition that the depth of a relationship must correspond to both parties' capacity to sustain it. Revealing too much depth too soon does not create intimacy. It creates unilateral vulnerability. And unilateral vulnerability for highly perceptive people who already carry the weight of being frequently misunderstood is too high a price to pay without any guarantee of reciprocity. Within the relationships you already have, the work is different. It is learning to use perception as a tool of compassion, not diagnosis. There is a huge difference between perceiving that someone is afraid and using that perception to create a safe space for them, versus perceiving that someone is afraid and feeling the need to name that fear immediately, force it to the surface, make it conscious before the person is ready. The first use of perception builds bonds. The second, though well-intentioned, destroys them, because consciousness that was not invited is invasion, no matter how accurate it may be. And here is the invitation I make to you now. The Code of Awakening is not just a map to understand what you see, it is a daily guide to learn to use what you see in a way that builds, that connects, that transforms, instead of merely revealing. 60 days, 60 lessons. A construction that no one can do for you, but that you don't have to do in the dark. The path is in the first pinned comment. This is the moment to decide if you want to keep carrying this perception without knowing what to do with it, or if you want to finally transform it into the instrument it was always meant to be. There is a concept that Jung developed late in his work that rarely receives the attention it deserves outside the circles of analytical psychology. He called the transcendent function the psyche's capacity to integrate seemingly irreconcilable opposites, and from that integration, generate something new that neither pole alone could produce. For the highly perceptive person, this transcendent function is the ultimate destination of all the work we have described so far. It is the point at which perceiving what no one else perceives ceases to be a source of suffering and becomes a source of service, not an imposed service. Not a service that demands gratitude or understanding from the other. A service that flows naturally from who you have become by integrating everything your perception has shown you. Because what happens when you integrate the shadow is that you stop projecting onto others what you do not recognize in yourself. And when you stop projecting, you gain access to a level of clarity about situations that is literally different from what it was before. Not because you have become smarter, but because you have removed the distorting filter that the unintegrated shadow produced. What you saw before was real, but it was mixed with what you refused to see in yourself. After integration, the vision becomes clean, precise, without the fog of the unrecognized. What happens when you develop real psychological boundaries is that you can be fully present for the other's experience without being swallowed by it. You can hear the pain without becoming the pain. You can perceive the fear without panicking along with it. You can identify the dysfunctional dynamic without needing to solve it alone or be consumed by it. This full and simultaneously distinct presence is what transforms perception into an instrument of genuine healing. Not yours, the other's. Because you become, for the first time, someone who can stand beside suffering without needing it to end for you to feel okay. And that capacity is extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily necessary. And what happens when you find your purpose, When you discover the specific way your perception can serve the development of consciousness around you, is that the loneliness that has accompanied your journey so far begins to transform. It does not disappear all at once, but it changes in nature. From a loneliness forced by non-recognition, it becomes the chosen solitude of one who knows they need space to process. And that difference is everything. Jung spent decades articulating the concept of the collective unconscious, the idea that there is a layer of the human psyche that is shared, that transcends the individual, that contains the archetypal patterns shaping human experience in all cultures and all times. And he believed that people of extraordinary perception have particular access to this collective unconscious. That their ability to perceive what others do not is, in part, because they are closer to this deep layer where the universal patterns of human experience reside. If this is true, and Jung's work suggests it is, then what you carry is not only yours. It belongs to humanity. What you perceive is not only about the individuals around you. It is about patterns that repeat everywhere, in every era, under every mask, and in every culture. And when you learn to use this perception with awareness, with humility, with boundaries, and with purpose, you are not only solving your own relational problems, you are contributing to something that goes far beyond you. This is the true weight of the gift. Not the weight of being misunderstood, the weight of responsibility, the weight of having access to something that, used wisely, can serve the evolution of consciousness around you in a way that few instruments can match. The real challenge was never seeing more than others. The real challenge is learning to use that sight in a way that builds, rather than merely reveals, that connects, rather than merely analyzes, that serves, rather than merely judges, that heals, rather than merely diagnoses. Jung did not arrive at this understanding through illumination. He arrived through work, decades of rigorous self-examination, of confronting his own shadow, of developing limits that allowed him to remain distinct while diving into his patient's unconscious, of learning how to use what he saw in a way that served their individuation, not his ego. He was a man who saw a great deal, and he spent his entire life learning to use that sight with a responsibility few can sustain. You now have a choice that is simpler than it seems, but more consequential than most people understand. You can close this video and go back to carrying what you carry the way you have always carried it. The perception does not disappear. The pain of not knowing what to do with it does not either. But you already knew that path, or you can begin the work, the real work, not of becoming less perceptive, of becoming integrated enough to use what you perceive as it was meant to be used. The Code of Awakening is in the first pinned comment, not as a promise that everything will be easy, but as the most accurate map that exists for the territory you inhabit. The illusion that seeing more is enough is already over. What you will do with what you see is the only question that remains.